Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to dig into a story about a surprise bonus for the troops that, well, turned out to be a lot more complicated than just a holiday gift. We are unpacking the warrior dividend.
So picture this. It's just a few days before the holidays, and suddenly there's this major primetime announcement. A direct promise to the nation's military for a surprise bonus with a name that was, let's be honest, impossible to ignore: the warrior dividend.
All right, let's start at the very beginning with the headline itself. What exactly was promised, and what did that mean for the folks on the ground?
And the amount? Well, that was no accident. $1,776. It's a direct nod to the year the United States was founded. So this wasn't just framed as a bonus, but as a deeply patriotic gesture.
In his speech, the president really presented this as a well-deserved thank you, and he made a very clear promise, saying the checks were, and I'm quoting here, already on the way.
So, on the surface, the details from the White House seemed pretty straightforward, right? A tax-free payment for over 1.4 million service members, supposedly funded by tariffs, and all of it arriving before Christmas. But, for the troops themselves, this huge promise immediately kicked off a wave of really practical questions.
And that brings us right to our next section, where we get to see how that big primetime announcement quickly morphed into a series of urgent questions from the very people it was supposed to benefit.
You can just imagine it. Almost instantly, military group chats, social media, family text threads, they just blew up with questions like these. The announcement was one thing, but actually getting the money into their accounts, that was the multi-billion-dollar question on everybody's mind.
So, with all this confusion swirling, the Pentagon did step in to release the official criteria. They confirmed, the payment would be tax-free. It would go to nearly 1.5 million troops, specifically those in pay grades 06 and below. And, importantly, this did include Guard and Reserve members who were on longer-term active orders, which answered one of the biggest questions right out of the gate.
All right, so once people started getting some answers, the reactions from the ranks really started to flood in. And let me tell you, it was this incredible mix of pure excitement, some great humor, and a whole lot of skepticism.
You had some people who saw this and were like, let's go. This one comment just says, Hellcat time. You can practically hear the engine revving on that one. For these folks, this was a serious windfall.
But then you had a lot of others who were way more cautious. This comment right here just nails it. I'll believe it when it's pending in my Navy Fed account. That perfectly sums up that seeing is believing attitude that's so common in military culture, It comes from hearing a lot of promises over the years that don't always pan out.
And then there was the timing, right before the holidays, and that very deliberate name, the warrior dividend, it just made some people suspicious. Like this user, who gets straight to the point. What's a warrior dividend? A bribe? They're basically asking, is this really a thank you, or is there a political angle here?
And this right here from a 14-year vet just captures that cautious mood perfectly. It's not just pessimism, it's that deep-down institutional knowledge that tells you when it comes to government funding, there's rarely such a thing as a free lunch.
And that very caution, that gut feeling that there might be more to the story, brings us to the absolute heart of this whole thing. Where did the money actually come from? We're talking about a total price tag of around $2.6 billion, and in that big speech, the president was crystal clear about how it was being paid for. Or so it seemed.
And this, right here, is the twist. The big public claim was that the money was from tariff revenue. But the reality? Well, senior administration officials were quietly telling the press something totally different. The funds came from money that Congress had already approved for military housing.
So how'd they do it? Well, here's the clever part. The payment wasn't some new pot of money created from tariffs. It was officially structured as a one-time, basic allowance for housing supplement. Now, this is the key bureaucratic move. Not only did it provide the funding, but because housing allowances are non-taxable, it also made the bonus tax-free. Pretty slick.
So basically, think of it like this. Congress had already set aside a big jar of money labeled housing costs for troops. What happened here was that money was taken out, put in a new, shinier box with warrior dividend written on it, and then presented as a special gift.
And that leads us to our final piece of the puzzle. This is where it gets really interesting, because we're talking about the difference between the policy on paper and the politics you see on your screen.
Okay, let's just walk through the chain of events one more time. First, Congress does its job, approving a large chunk of money for military housing. Then, that money gets a catchy new name,
This rebranded dividend is then announced in a primetime speech citing a completely different funding source. And finally, behind the scenes, the real source is quietly clarified by officials to reporters.
You know, this comment from a Reddit user posted just hours after the announcement just cuts right through all the political spin and absolutely nails it. But it's not just a cynical take, it gets to a much bigger question. So what? Why does any of this matter?
Well, it matters because it's a perfect example of how the presentation of information can be just as powerful as the information itself. This was a masterclass in political framing, taking a routine and essential government function and turning it into a major political event.
At the end of the day, the money was real. It did land in service members' bank accounts right before Christmas, just as promised. But the story of how it got there was far more complex than that initial headline. So it leaves us with a fascinating question. Can something be both a powerful political message and a deserved bonus at the same time? In this case, it was a moment where policy, politics, and paychecks all collided.